here we are. So we're reviewing that homework, building the app, a blog app using both the HTTP module and Express. So let's get to it. Got this open here in Atom. Oh, this is my version. There were no automated tests in your guys' version. The objective is create two servers, one with HTTP and one with Express, and the server should behave like so. When a user goes to / or the home, the root of the site, they see the home page. When they go to /about, they see the about page. When they go to /posts, they see a page with a list of blog posts. And when they see /posts/ID, that should say post ID. Sorry, I copied over my version, not your version. I should have done that. They should see a page showing the individual blog posts. So the only difference is that one server should be listening on port 4000 and one should be listening on port 5000. We have some starter code. Here in Node HTTP server, we've got some setup for handlebars. So we've got all of these various different handlebars templates. They're being loaded and compiled, and they're added to this object templates. We have our data for our application coming in from datastore.js. And yeah, so that's where we're starting off. Let's do this in HTTP first, and then we're going to look at how it's done in Express. Now, I based on feedback from this homework, it seems like HTTP was a sticking point for a lot of folks. Like maybe it didn't really take super well from the lab on Monday. So we'll just walk through that and kind of go through some of the basics of building a server in HTTP. You're not going to need to do this much, but it's good to know about. And if you do need to make like a tiny dinky server to just like serve up something small, HTTP can do that really fast. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is we need to actually create a server. So the way that we do that was first we require the HTTP module. HTTP module is one of the default modules that comes with Node, so we don't need to download it or anything through NPM. But even if we did, we would require it in just the same way. I'm also going to get the URL module. I don't need it, but it makes some things a little bit simpler. Okay, so how do we create a server using the HTTP module? The HTTP module, its entire purpose is to provide a way for making servers and clients in Node. That's all it does. And it's designed to make it possible so that we can set up these things with a minimum of effort. So the way that we create a server using this HTTP module is it has a method called createServer. And that method returns a server. createServer expects a function. And you see I wrote res here. This is a common shorthand for request response. It's just what that stands for. So we've created a server. And then once we create that server, we say server.listen. Now we said we wanted to listen to port 4000. Ports, I mentioned this a little bit yesterday, they're kind of like radio frequencies or radio microwave bands. You can kind of tune in to a particular station. That's sort of what ports are. So when our server is tuning in to port 4000, that means it's listening for requests that come in on that particular channel. And that's it. This is it. This is all you need to do to create a server using the HTTP module. You require HTTP, you run the createServer method, and you take that server and you tell it to listen to a particular port. We can start this right now if we want. I created a file called main.js, which launches both the Node server and the Express server, just because I didn't want to type both, but you can type node HTTP server.js. That'll also work. Okay, so I start that running. And if I go to localhost 4000, it's taking a minute. I don't have any other servers running right now, do I? Oh, I do. Ha, sorry, I could have killed that.
None of those numbers are unique, like to multiple websites, like where you're local hosting like 4,000 and stuff like that.
So there's a couple of standard ones that you will use, and sometimes you'll see ones that get used by default by different frameworks and tools.
Yeah, like 8080 or something like that. It's like one that's commonly used, right?
Yeah. If you're using Ruby on Rails, it's port 3000. That's the default one. Syntax error. Oh, right. So our server isn't actually giving anything back. It's sort of just spinning its wheels indefinitely because we haven't told it to respond in any way. That's what this res object is. Res is an object that represents our response, the thing that comes back from the site. So we can just say res.end site. I'll kill that. Restart it. Actually, I'm going to use nodemon because that's going to allow me to live update.
And what does end stands for?
Nodemon stands for node monitor. What does it do? It monitors all the.
Oh, sorry, the end.
What?
Ends.
End.
Res dot.
End. It means end, as in it ends your response. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Right?
Thanks.
That's what tells your response to actually fire. You can build, the reason it's called end is that you can build a response over multiple steps, and only when you actually call res.end does it send the response. But I agree, it's not the clearest name. I think a better name for it would be res.send, because when you send, that's when you actually send the response. Maybe that would have been a better name, but that's not the name. It's called end. Deal. So here is, if you go to localhost 4000, you can see the text site, because that's what the response is. We got this information back from our server. Isn't it kind of interesting that like a server is really just these two things? The only thing that defines a service is when you get a request of some type, you deliver some type of response. That's the entirety of what defines a service. How you handle a request and what you give back. And those are actually two separate problems within the scope of building a server. The process of like taking in a request and figuring out exactly what to do with that request, that process is called routing. We kind of have talked about this a little bit tangentially. If you think back to, I know this may be a little traumatic for folks, but the Star Wars example from Unit 1 in that homework, in that case, you were getting an argument from the command line. You were getting, you know, pieces of data that were coming in. And based on that input, you needed to make a decision. Which of the different things was I going to do based on that input? So that problem is called routing. Then there's the question of how you actually respond. And that involves using things like templates, or sometimes just sending back text in this case, right? This isn't HTML. This was just pure plain text that came back. The reason it's text and it doesn't have to be HTML is that the thing that's coming along the wire when we send a message is just text. It's bits, you know, that are coming across the line, and they're being interpreted by the server program as characters. And then the browser, if it's HTML code, the browser reads that text, interprets it as HTML, builds the DOM, and does all the other nice things that happen when we look at a web page. But it's all just text at the end of the day. Text files getting sent along the wire. For instance, if I were to say, instead of just site, Won't let me cheat. Okay, fine. If I were to make this text HTML instead of just plain text, I can do that. And see NodeMon restarted. It detected that I made changes to the file. So it restarts the server, reloads the code files. So now if I go to localhost 4000 again, I see a page. There's no magic in it. I just sent back different content. The trick is that when the text gets received by the browser, it chooses how to respond to it. And if it gets HTML, it builds it like a page. There's other kinds of things that you can send too. It doesn't have to be HTML. There's a thing that you guys are going to see in a short while called JSON. This thing kind of looks like a JavaScript object, right? It's another format for sending text. It's not HTML, it's something else. I actually have a tool in my browser that makes this kind of come out all pretty, but it's just another format for sending data as text over the wire. But let's come back to the HTML for a minute. If we're just serving up a static HTML page like this, that's all well and good, but we don't really need Node for that. You know, you can have a kind of more low-level server that just hosts static HTML pages. What makes Node meaningful, the reason it exists, is because you don't want to be able to just generate a static page. You want to generate what's called a dynamic page. In other words, you want to be able to generate new HTML from your data rather than hard coding in every single page that you might want for your app. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We want to do something where we read the request that comes in and we send out a different response. So let's read that request. Rec is the object that represents the incoming request. And we can actually take a look at that. So here is the request object. It's big and it's got lots of properties, most of which we don't see and use. Some of them are things like headers or complete or let's see, writable, allow, have open, connection, all just different properties that describe this request that comes in over the wire. And the HTTP module is what's building this thing. It does it for us. It knows how to handle HTTP requests, and it builds these kinds of objects. Here's a key property, a couple key properties, actually. rec.url, rec.method. They're kind of some of the core pieces. Put method first. The core pieces of information that come in with any given request. Okay, so what do we see? Well, when we console.logged rec.url and rec.method, we saw that we had a GET request at the URL /. There was also a secondary request for a favicon. Anytime that you have assets that are referenced by your HTML file, the browser makes a follow-on request for that asset too. So that's not just true of favicons, it's true of images, it's true of CSS files, it's true of JavaScript. Anytime that you reference another file from your HTML, what happens is that the browser makes another request for that thing. So in this case, we've requested this page at the root, And the browser also saw that there was something in here indicating a favicon. I think that may just be the default setting for Chrome, that it looks for a favicon by default. So it made a request for that as well. We don't have one, so it doesn't find anything. But it tries to find a favicon. If I go to a different URL, that gets detected as well. So it's taking that request that's coming in and it's doing something interesting with it. Okay. So let's do some more with this. We said in the documentation that what we want to happen is that if somebody visits /, they should see the site's homepage. How can we tell if they're visiting /? First of all, what does it mean in terms of HTTP to be visiting a page? What does that mean? Can anyone jump in?
Sending a request.
The page. What's really going on under the hood?
So the viewer sends a request and gets a response.
Correct. That's right. So when you visit a web page, what's going on is that your browser is making a request and it's getting back HTML. What kind of request is it if you want to get a page? What type? What verb?
Get.
That's right. It's a GET request. Okay. So if we were to say if we have a GET request, at the root, do something. Let's put that in here and we'll say, this is going to say home for now. We're not going to worry about what the responses are just yet. We're just going to send them out. Okay. What's another one? What's another thing that we need to respond to? It's another type of request that we need. When a user visits about, they should see the site's about page. Okay, cool. So if this is visiting home, what should we write for visiting the about page? Anyone guide me through it? What should I write here?
You'll write if rec.method equals get and rec.url equals /about.
That's right. Okay, and we'll send a different response for that one. So we'll say about. Okay. Now we say when a user visits /posts, they should see something else. How do we handle that one? Someone else. What should I write here? Talk me through. Let's hear from Rachel. Rachel, what should I write here in order to respond to /posts?
The same thing you did above, just with posts. So /posts
So a method should be what?
equals get. And then and request URL equals /post. Posts.
Cool. Very nice. So these two properties, the method and the URL, these are the things that fundamentally define what a request is. You make a type of request to a particular URL. This is also commonly referred to as a route. A route is the combination of a method and a URL. Or alternatively, you could say a route is a type of request that your server responds to. It's a route for those requests. Okay, in this case, we'll do that. this is going to say posts. And I'll just do the last one because I think you guys get it at this point. This is going to be posts. Oh, this one's a little tricky. For the last one, it says post/post ID. This is like some post ID that we might get. We don't know what that is. This one's a little tricky to do just with Node. It doesn't really have the architecture for dealing with dynamic segments. That's not something that Node does very easily. We can sort of hack it though. We can say maybe rec.url.includes posts / something. If it was just /posts, we know that it would get routed here. So if it starts in /post/, then it's /post/ something else, whatever that post ID might be. Okay. All right, let's pause here and test out the app. If I go to 4000, oh. Homepage, about page. Posts. Single post. Okay, this, in a nutshell, is the routing of the app. This is how our app knows when it gets a specific request, how it should respond. This isn't the part of it that deals with the response. This is just figuring out how to respond. That process is routing. Okay, let's make this a little bit more interesting. We actually have some further requirements for this, right? When they visit /, they should see the home page. When they see about, they should see the about page. When they see post, they should see a page containing a list of links to posts. Okay, so we need to be sending back some HTML. Not this HTML, but some other HTML. Actually, this HTML. The stuff that's here in these views, right? So if we want to send back this HTML, we have that template loaded already. That's been provided for us. So if we want to return that HTML specifically, instead of sending back this arbitrary string, we can say return templates.home. It does need to get an object as an argument. This is a feature of handlebars specifically. Handlebars templates will not load if they don't get anything. You need to give them at least an empty object in order for the handlebars template to load. That's just a quirk of how it is. If we do that, and we try going back to localhost 4000, we see a page. This is not routing. This is the view layer, so it's called, because it deals with the response that the user gets to their request. So it's like receiving the request and then responding to it. Those two separate problems. Often there's also a third step in there, receiving a request, manipulating data, sending a response. Okay, so we've got this with home. Let's do it with about. What should I write here? Brad, what should I write here?
Templates.about.
Okay.
And then the curlies.
Mm-hmm. Let's test it. We don't believe it till we've seen it for ourselves. Okay, now we have an about page. Cool. How about posts? Anyone want to jump in and do this one? What do we put here? Promise I won't bite.
Oh, templates.posts.
Cool, right? We have a template. Posts, is it called posts?
Oh, actually not sure.
Well, let's
Post list.
post list. That's what it's called here. I mean, if it was called posts, then we could say posts, but it's not. It's called that instead, so we'll call it that. Now let's take a look at post list. If we take a look at that view, the post list handlebars template is a little bit different than home and about. Posts actually is going to be embedding some information. Specifically, it's looking for something called posts to be defined. And given that it's inside this each helper, that means that posts is probably needing to be an array of objects specifically. And on each of those objects, they're going to need to be properties like post ID or title or date. This also gives us an idea of maybe what kind of data we're working with in our application, right? So assuming that we need to get a thing called posts in this template, how do we do that? How do we decide to give data to our handlebars template?
Can we just include posts as a key in that what would have been an empty array before, and then just include posts as its value?
What is it called?
Posts.
Yeah, that's right. We can absolutely do that. I mean, this, to be clear, this key refers to this. In other words,
Right.
what is called inside the template.
So
This is a reference.
Because-
If this was called post list instead, this would be
right.
post list.
So adding the posts or adding the post key in there still is going to call the main section of post list along with the included information in the actual list of posts.
Say that one more time.
It's because everything's so calling the object, which before it was empty,
Mhm.
with a key and value in it,
Mhm.
it is it's still going to render the main page section of that post list.
I'm still
The
not sure
HTML.
question, Eric. But maybe this will make it more clear. If you think about handlebars templates as being like a game of Mad Libs, has anyone ever played Mad Libs? You guys might be familiar with this? Not everybody has. Whatever, you know.
Mhm.
Mad Libs, you have like you have a document and it says things like, okay, insert a noun here and a verb here and an adjective here. And so if somebody were to give you a table that said, okay, noun is hair and verb is runs and adjective is pink, right? You could then take all that information and plug it into the Mad Libs and you would get, you know, a silly sounding bit of text. That is pretty much exactly what's going on in handlebars. That object that you're passing into the template, this is called the context object for whatever that's worth, but it just contains a list of like what these things mean when handlebars encounters them in the template. So this says, hey, handlebars, when you see the term posts, I mean this thing. Okay, let's test it and see if it works. Oh, hey, that's pretty cool. Now, what would happen if instead of being this, I just said it's an empty array? What's going to happen if I refresh this page? Any guesses?
You just won't get any links to select.
Let's check. Interesting. Our HTML depends on the data. If our data is different, our HTML is different. if you think back to maybe some of the stuff that you did in Unit 1 with like UI, where you maybe take like a piece of data and you turn that into HTML on the page, that's fundamentally what's going on with this. Handlebars is generating HTML from data. Cool. Let's do this one. This one's the toughest. Why? Well, if we take a look at the handlebars template here, post, it's looking for data. It's looking for data on a specific post, right? Post ID, date, a body. So we need to give it the information of one specific post. Well, what post are we going to load? We can try just filling in some dummy data in the meantime. Passing an empty object. Let's see what we get. Nope, there's no data. So handlebars can't render correctly. So our server says, nope, no page here. It errors out before it can send something back. Or to be more precise, it's saying it's not going to connect with us. So we need to give it some data. How do we know what post we want? It seems like here we're saying we want post 3. According to the README, it says this thing is the post ID. So maybe we want to find the post whose post ID is equal to 3. How could we go about doing that? Let's assume that we know that it's 3 already. So we say post ID equals 3. How could we go about getting the post that we want? What do we do? What could we do? How could we get the post that has post ID of 3? Tom?
We can the way that made sort of sense to me was that up on line 17, we got a require statement that basically says, take the data in lib/datastore.js and load it into this file. So what we can do is we can look at the structure of the data in that.
We kind of know what this is, right? We know that it's an array because post list was expecting an array for posts. So post list is an array of post objects. Given that, how do we get the specific post that we want? Why don't you write it in Slack? Everyone just take a second and write down in Slack how you think we can get the specific post we want from the list. Eric, that's the wrong question. That is a separate question. How do we get the number? Assuming that we know that the number is 3. Well, okay, we know it's an array, but we're looking for a specific property, post ID. Do we know necessarily that the posts are going to be in order? That seems like a good answer. let's try that out. So let's say var my post, or this post, or one post maybe. That's a good name, one post, equals post list dot find. Okay, what are we trying to find, Rachel?
You're trying to find the post ID.
Okay, sure. So what will we write here? What arguments does find expect?
Well, I didn't get mine working for that one. So,
But do you looked at the documentation, I'm guessing, for find when you were trying to get it working. So what should we put here? What kind of thing, first of all?
another function.
Okay, so we want to give it a function. And what is that function going to expect? What is that function going to get when it's called?
An element.
Okay, sure. In this case, it's a post, right? We have a list of posts, so one element is a post. Okay, and what is that function supposed to return in order for find to work correctly?
The post ID.
Someone help Rachel out. How does find work? What does find need from its callback in order to work correctly?
Isn't it a true or false Boolean it returns?
That's right. The function that you give to find is a predicate function. It's going to take an argument, and whether some condition is true, it's going to return true or false based on some set of conditions. Based on that, post_list.find, I should say, is going to attempt to find the first element for which that callback returns true. So given that, how could we find the first post whose post ID is equal to 3?
Return post ID equals equals post ID.
Okay, let's try this out. And we're going to put this post into the template just to see it in the HTML. Okay. Yeah. Template is templates. Oops. Okay. Cool. It doesn't look like there is one, but it's doing something. It's sending back HTML and it's not giving us an error. Let me console.log one post and see what it looks like. Oh, no, it does exist. It didn't load correctly. Oh, I know why. Because we didn't call it post. The properties inside our template don't reference post anywhere. They don't refer to post. So saying that this object is called post doesn't actually help the template find what it needs. The template is looking for an object that has properties post ID, title, date, and body. In other words, the properties that are found on the post itself. So in this case, we can just say one post. And there we go. Our page is loaded. Now we just have one last piece of the problem. How do we get the right ID? I mean, right now, we're just always getting 3. What if we want to get posts 2? That's not right. We don't want post 3. How do we get post 2 instead of post 3? Eric, you already mentioned it earlier, so I'll just put it in. We know the URL looks something like this. So we could split it by slashes to get an array. And just take the last thing. Errors. Rect.url.split slice -1. I have an error somewhere. Anyone spot? Did I make a typo? Rect.url.split. Oh, you know, it's probably from copying that I copied from Slack. Dumb. Should never do that.
It's actually, that's not the error.
Yeah? What is the error?
You're forgetting your curly brackets in your templates.post in your response.end.
I'm forgetting my, no, one post is an object.
Oh, okay. So
No, I'm not BSing you guys. This is a weird one. Let me see.
the reason why,
I
because
know what it is. I know what it is.
Oh.
Here's why.
It's a string, right?
Well, it's an object. Maybe I should say instance of string. No, it's not a string. Is it a number? It shouldn't. It's not a number, because if it were a number, this would work. Well, it isn't a number, which is the important thing. Whether it's a string or I don't know why it's being written as an object, but it needs to be a number. So let's convert that whole thing to a number.
¿Cómo?
There we go. Cool. These links work, by the way. You didn't have to do anything for them. They just point to a particular path. Your browser does the rest. So we go to posts. We can see all the posts. Oh, look, it's post 1. Very cool. So now we have our blog app working in Node using the HTTP module. We could have used this, we could have made this a little bit shorter if we used URL, the URL module. I mean, its purpose is to parse URLs to get specific pieces of information. And it's not so pertinent here necessarily, but when you start getting query parameters involved, that's when it becomes more relevant, because this rec.url will include the query parameters.
Will you also post this solution later, Matt?
Yes, this solution will be posted. I think I've usually been pretty good about posting.
Yeah, just making sure.
Yeah.
I'd like to have a look at it again.
For sure. So yeah, in this case, rather than saying rec.url, you could just say path. But again, that's not really so necessary here because we're not dealing with any query parameters. So no big.
How did you change all of that at the same time?
That is an atom trick called multiple select. If you do Command D after selecting something, it will select another instance where it appears in the text every time you press Command D.
Command D, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, so we have this working in Node. Awesome. Now let's get it working in Express.
Matt,
Yep.
I have a question before you move to the other one.
Sure.
Yesterday on the lab, when we were doing this one, I mean, for Monday, it was a little different how they did, like you have your server that listen in the bottom, and the one that we have as an example, it was more like bar servers, then HTTP that create server that listen 4,000, like all the
Yeah,
other ones.
that's fine. You don't have to put it in a variable, but you can.
Okay,
Whether you put
but
it
I will.
Oh, sorry. Go on, Sarah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, but I will still gonna have to have something that has like a request and response, and then put everything inside of that, right?
Yes, this request response, this function is what defines the server. A server is defined by how it takes a request and how it responds. This function defines what makes that server unique. It's the piece of the server that makes this specific server behave this specific way. Everything apart from this function is going to be exactly the same from one server to the next.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, let's move on to Express. So how do we do things at Express? We don't have to kind of create a server using the HTTP module. Instead, in Express, we have a thing called an app, which gets returned from this function. So that's kind of just a noteworthy whatever. But Express, this thing that's returned from the module, is a function which you invoke. And then Express returns an object called app. So don't forget to invoke it, because then it won't work. But okay, so app is this object that gets returned from the Express function. It's an app factory, if you will. Every app can be configured, and in this case, it's been configured for us. So we want to set the view engine for this app to be HBS, or handlebars. And we've set, well, actually, that's specifically HBS. And we've set the location of our views to be /views. We also have the same data, right? Same views, same data as with the Node app. It's just using Express this time. So what Express is going to be doing is the same thing that Node did, which is reading in the request or doing the routing and handling the response, sending back HTML. So that is what Express is responsible for here. How do we get started? What are the things that we need to do in order to get Express to behave the same way as this guy?
app.get,
Okay. Why get? Why is that the name of the method?
because we want to get the path.
Nope.
Just kidding.
Why is it called .get?
You want to get the root?
Sorry, is that Richie?
You wanted to get the root, the route, whatever?
Nope. That's not what get means.
We are making a request.
I'm making a get request as opposed to a post request or a put request or a patch request or a delete request. The names of the methods are the HTTP verbs. So if I say get /, that's the same as this, get request at root. Okay. Rather than having one giant rec-res function for the entire app, Express has lots of little ones for each specific route.
That's just a question. So basically Express is just actually evoking on the backgrounds what you wrote on the HTTP, right?
In a manner of speaking, there's more stuff there. Express has a lot of other machinery that we're not necessarily using right now. which is why when your apps are small, you tend to favor things like this because there's not a whole lot of stuff here, right? You can look over the entire thing in a single glance. But when you want your apps to become more sophisticated, you tend to favor a framework instead. For example, when we were looking at this case, right, having a dynamic segment in our URL, a part that could change, right? Figuring that out in Node with HTTP was kind of clunky. And it doesn't actually work super well. Like, we didn't really check to see that this is a valid number or anything like that. We don't know what would happen if there were other things in this URL. Like maybe if it was posts 5, comments 3, right? So that wouldn't work. That whole process gets more complicated as the URLs become more complicated. So dealing with that in Node is kind of painful. But Express makes that easy. Okay, let's come back though. What is it that we need to do in Express for showing HTML for this route? The content of this before was that we sent back data from the home template. How do we do that in Express? We're using handlebars as part of the Express app already. So what interface does Express give us for showing HTML?
Render.
Render. And what does the rendering? What object is responsible for rendering?
Response.
Response, that's right. Yep. Just like response was responsible for sending out the thing here, here it's also responsible for rendering. Okay, so when we call render, what do we give it? What are the arguments that render takes?
The view name.
Okay, and the view name here is home, right? That's what it's called, home.hps. And what else do we give it? Well, maybe nothing. I'm going to pull up the, where did that go? I'm going to pull up a new tab for looking at localhost 5000. Which is where we're going to be hosting our Express app. Oh, shoot, there's nothing there. Did we forget something?
You need to render the object in there.
Run the you need to run the server.
We need to run the server, or well, we're running the server, but what do we need to do specifically? How does our Express app know what port to listen to?
You have to define the port.
Tell it. Listen to port 5000. Okay. All right. So actually, we don't need to give it any data. Express is wrapping around handlebars and smoothing out some of the edges. When working with handlebars directly, we had to pass an empty object, even if we weren't giving our template any data. But in this case, we don't need to specify anything. Express will take care of that for us. Cool. That route is done. Let's do another one. Someone talk me through doing the about route. Sean, walk me through how I would create a route for /about.
App.get /about.
Okay, and why get? Why get?
Because we're making a GET request.
Okay.
I get that now.
Cool.
All right, and then function request respond res.render about.
And why is it called about? Why do we write that here?
Because that's what the view page is.
Okay, that's what it's called, right? We named our handlebars template about.
Right.
In the views directory, so we can just do that. If we had it nested inside another directory, like views, say posts, and we moved these in here instead, then we would say posts/about, for instance. Actually, about would probably not be there because it's about the page as a whole, but you can have things nested in those references as well. Okay, next route. Let's get Sanaz. Help me out with this. I want to show the posts. So how do I do that route?
Okay, app.get posts/posts, and then function request response, and then response.render.
And what do we render?
Post list.
Okay, posts list. That is what it is.
The handlebars.
Yeah, post list. So how do we write that?
Post-list.
Yes, very good. That's what it is in the file name. That's what it is here. Okay. Do we need anything else?
When you go into the app get/posts, won't that mess up because you have the actual file as post.handlebars, not /posts?
We're not loading posts. We're loading list.
Gotcha. All right. I was a little bit confused.
And these are not strictly speaking connected. You can call your URL one thing and have your template be something completely different.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
You probably wouldn't want to do that, or at least not make them too different. When you're doing CRUD, you guys started doing that a little bit today, right? Create, read, update, destroy. There's kind of like a standard set of routes that you use and a standard set of CRUD behaviors associated with those routes. So in those cases, the URL does not necessarily match perfectly what it is doing. For instance, if we're talking about posts, you might see posts is the index. In other words, we want to see all of the posts. Posts 10 would be a show behavior because we want to see one specific post. I should clarify that these are GET requests, specifically those two. Post to /posts. This is the standard for a create. A put, or usually a patch actually, rather than a put, to some post is an update. And a delete to that post is a destroy. This is the standard convention for how you define routes for a particular resource that you want to do CRUD with. Doing CRUD is a very common thing in an application. And so having resources, things that you CRUD, means that you'll typically be setting up routes like this. Index show, these are two different kinds of reading, right? Create is create, obviously, and update and destroy. Okay, there's two others though that sort of factor into this, which you don't necessarily see in all servers, but you will see here because we're delivering HTML. How does somebody make a post or a patch request through our site? They can't do it by visiting a URL in the browser. And actually, they can't make a delete request really either. So how do we do that? How do they do that? What's the interface for creating or editing something on a page? Looking for one word.
Form?
Form, precisely. Okay, but a form is in your HTML. So how do you get that form? Well, there are routes for getting a form. There's a route to get a form for creating something. That's called the new route. And then there's the form for editing something. That's the edit route. So those two aren't strictly CRUD behaviors, but they're related to CRUD in that when you're using HTML, you need to send a form in order to make changes to the site. So the new route and the edit route serve up forms. And then when you submit the forms, submitting the form triggers a create or an update. Okay, this is at a high level what you're going to be doing pretty much every time that you have a resource. The standard CRUD routes. I'll paste that into Slack. Man, that's weird. That's weird formatting. Okay. Anyway, yeah. This is the REST conventions actually. REST is a term that describes the way that you interact with a service or application. It means representative state transfer, and that's not really so important. But it's a set of conventions that define how your service behaves. So that's kind of what this is all about. The core idea of it is that your app is essentially stateless. So it doesn't store information in itself from one request to the next. It uses information from the request to figure out how to respond. And that's really good because it means that it doesn't need to deal with like making sure that it keeps track of one particular user's requests over time. It just handles each response independently. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish this up. We have the post list. We wanna show that. So if we go to well, let's check about that about works just real quick. About works fine. We go to posts. We're not seeing any posts. The page is loading, but we don't see anything. What's wrong? What are we missing? What do we need? What does our template need in order to work?
The posts.
Yep, needs the posts, needs data. I'll call that post list just to avoid confusion. All right, try that. And hey, there's all of our stuff. Neat. Now these links don't work yet, but pretty much everything else does. Okay, let's handle that last route. What do we do? Tell me what to do. First of all, what route is it?
Post.
Yeah, right, single post. Or if we're going to use the REST terminology, what type of route is it?
Dynamic one?
Dynamic means that it's generating new HTML. But you're right, it has a dynamic segment, a piece of the URL that changes, right? But what route does that correspond to? Show. Yep, that's right. It's a show route because it shows us one post. Okay, so which is the show route in our node example? Which of the four is our show route from node? A, B, C, or D? Which one's the show route?
It's going to be D, right? The more complicated one.
Yeah, that's right. It's the more complicated one. You are correct. That's the show route. So how do we do that over here in Express? Obviously, there's going to be an app.get because it is a GET request, right? What do we need to write here? How do we tell Express that we're dealing with a dynamic segment? What does Express need in order to do that? I'll put in the boilerplate stuff, the stuff that we know needs to be there. Request. All right, so what does Express need when we have a dynamic segment?
Is this when you use like the directory name, make it static? Something weird like that?
No. We need to be able to tell Express that there's extra information coming along with the URL. Right?
Is this the semicolon thing?
Yeah, the colon. Yeah, right. Not the semicolon. This is semicolon. But like,
Yeah, sorry, colon.
That's exactly right. If we say posts colon post ID, this is actually a special instruction for Express. It says, if you see a URL that matches this pattern, take whatever is over here and store it on the request. Okay, assuming that it's stored on the request, can anyone tell me where it's stored? How do we get it out of the request object? Where does it live on rec? Any guesses?
Is it the params thing?
Yes, that's correct. All right, so it's inside rec.params. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Here's our server. Righto. So here's this. And if we go to posts, I'll just click one. Okay, it says it's an object. Rec.params is an object. And the key on that object is called post ID. And its value is a string with the number 1. So what happens is that Express is taking that URL, and when we tell it that there's a dynamic segment, it says, okay, there's more data here. I'm going to add this to the list of parameters that came in with the request. And what does it call it? Well, it calls it what we told it to call it, post ID. If we said banana, well, you guys know the drill. But we don't want to call it that because it's not a banana. It's post ID. Okay. So we've gotten this information out. By the way, what does this kind of map to? It's this bit, right? Where we were kind of slicing and dicing the URL to try and figure out what that thing was.
Did you only add that last line of code in just to make it more like user friendly for us, or was that
Yep.
necessary?
Nope, it's not necessary. Console.log is never functionally necessary.
Oh, I was talking about the one above it where you added like the variable post ID.
Oh, yeah, you don't strictly need to put these things in variables, but it's helpful for breaking this up into small steps. Just grind it up into little pieces for you guys. So, okay, so we've got this number, post ID. We've pulled it out of the URL. Now that we've done that, how do we use it to get the right post, A, and then show it? Well, actually, that's almost exactly the same, right? The part that deals with the data isn't Express. Express isn't doing this. This is just some other piece that involves getting the data. Express doesn't deal in data. Express doesn't store things. It doesn't, calculate things. That's not what Express does. Express handles incoming requests and sends responses. If you want to store data with your application, you've got to plug Express into something else. In this case, that thing that we're plugging it into is the data from data store, an array. Usually, though, it's more complicated than that, because arrays are fine for like storing 10 things, but not so great for storing 10 million things. When you store 10 million things, arrays tend not to work so well. So we'll want to use some other kind of tool for that. Okay, but putting that aside, we want to get the data, and then we want to send a response. All right, so getting the data, I'm just going to copy and paste this because it's exactly the flipping same. Okay. And we can console.log that if we want to just double check it. So if I go to posts 1, there's post 1. That's the post that I wanted. Post ID 1, that sounds right. Okay. Now we need to send the response back to Express. What does Express do to send a response here?
You're going to need to render that data as like an object.
We want to render it. How do we render it? What do we need to give it? What does render take?
A string or a request, I mean?
It takes, say again?
A string or a request, one of the two.
A request? Does it actually take a request? Can you just render rec? Maybe you can. For our purposes, let's just say a string. I'm going to check that in the docs.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it'd be called like a string or a request in this case.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we're a string because it's a string that Express is going to use via handlebars to load the appropriate template. Right? We want to load the view that we want to send back. Okay, so we want to send back a view. We want to send back some HTML. Render, so the template, what's the template that we want?
Post.
Post, yep. And what's the data?
The data is going to be the post list, right?
No, we want to send back one post. This is the show action. When you show one thing. When you do index, you show more than one. Index, by the way, doesn't always, strictly speaking, mean show all, although it usually does. It can also mean show some. That can also be handled by index. Okay, so we'll save this and let's refresh. So here's our standard lorem ipsum. Beautiful. Corporate ipsum. Hipster ipsum. And Samuel L. ipsum. Okay, everything is working. Let's take a look at these again side by side. What are some of the similarities between how things are being done using pure, just this node, HTTP node module versus how things are done in Express? What are some of the similarities and some of the differences?
You still have to get the methods. They just got in different ways.
Yeah.
You just go them differently.
Pretty much. They're two tools, two different tools that do the same job. They need to do the same things. They just do them slightly differently.
Yeah, one's like a command and one's a series of commands that like result in something. It looks like.
Which one is which?
Your Express is just like you can just do like app.get as opposed to like you have to create some sort of like if statement where like the method and then equals get and then you create and a path and then grab about and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah, you have many of these request response functions, as opposed to one big one like you have over here. Now, this is a bit of a magic trick. The request and response object that Express uses are not exactly the same as the ones that HTTP uses, but that's sort of the point. The Express ones are objects that have more properties and more methods so that you can do cooler stuff. But they work in basically the same way.
It's like HTML with superpowers.
With superpowers. Yeah, right. Think like JS DOM and jQuery, right? They're both representations of interacting with the DOM, but the jQuery stuff has more methods and is more powerful in a lot of ways. Similarly, Express and the HTTP module both allow you to create servers, but the Express one does more stuff. Granted, though, there is a trade-off. More power, more complexity.
Were you about to go Star Wars on us and tell us more power comes more response? Or what was that? Batman?
Spider-Man?
Great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
Yes, Spider-Man.
Yeah,
Spider-Man. That's what it was. I knew it was one of those movies.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's true. When you have more powerful stuff, it means that you have to do more work. That's actually just straight up true. When you're using a framework, you need to be able to work within the confines of that framework. But when you use it correctly, when you've done your homework and not literally, but like when you've done your research on the framework and you read about how it's supposed to work and you know that interface inside and out, you can do some really amazing things. Cool. That's the homework. It's 3:52.
The guys who created the frameworks are really smart.
Yeah. Creating a framework is non-trivial. But the point of a framework is that it saves you work over time. That's why frameworks exist. Because particularly if you're making the same application or similar applications like 50 times, you are going to want to save yourself effort so that you're not wasting time. One story that I like about how kind of frameworks can get created is Rails. So Rails is a web framework written in the Ruby programming language. It's what we'll be covering in Unit 4. And it was created by a guy, a consultant named David Heinemeier Hannison, who was a consultant working for a consulting company. And he was building web applications. And he was building basically the same web application for every one of his clients. And it was like, 80% the same, and like 15 to 20% customization. So he got the idea, oh, well, rather than wasting all this time building out like templates or using templates, I'm just going to build an app that generates a template from the command line. And then I'm going to build on that template and customize it as I need. And that's going to save me a lot of time and energy. And that's where Rails comes from. Rails was that templating tool, that framework for building applications. Express works the same way. It's, well, I'm not literally the same way as Rails, but I mean, it's the same purpose, that you can take a lot of the machinery that underlies a web application, stuff that you don't even see here, right? Like, oh, how do we actually like make the HTTP request, and how do we send a signal across the wire, and how do we parse the URL, and all of those problems that you'd have to do by hand if you were, writing this up from the very beginning. These are solved problems. Express has solved them. And so rather than going through this nonsense, or sorry, I'm not screen sharing anymore. Rather than going through like the business of parsing out the URL every time, for instance, and like running the risk that that's going to screw up, we can just take advantage of what Express knows how to do. And Express can also handle things that are more complicated than what we had over here. Maybe if we have posts and comments. Express can handle this. HTTP can't. Not, at least not as written. We'd have to change it. We have to write more code in order to make that work. Okay, it's 3:55. I'm going to share out this recording later today. I'll post up these solutions for this momentarily. You guys have outcomes at 4, so let's take a quick break.
Sorry, Matt, when you say post, is uploading to GitHub.
I'm sorry?
When you say
Yeah,
post
the
a solution,
on the GitHub repo. That's right.
Ah,